Good evening. My name is Bella Lapp, and I am a student project manager for the Clark Forum for Contemporary Issues at Dickinson College. On behalf of the Clark Forum and the Departments of Political Science, Data Analytics, English and Mathematics, and Computer Science, I would like to welcome you to tonight's event, Combating Online Harms, the Importance of Rigorous Scientific Testing for Proposed Interventions. Tonight's event was initiated by the Clark Forum's student project managers. It is also this year's Bruce R. Andrews Lecture. Until he passed away on January 8, 2005, Bruce R. Andrews was Robert Blaine Weaver Professor Emeritus of Political Science. Bruce taught at Dickinson from 1960 until his retirement in 1992. As a living memorial for the example Professor Andrews set as a teacher, mentor, and friend, those who knew him have endowed the Bruce R. Andrews Fund to continue the kind of vibrant discussions of politics and public life that Bruce devoted his life to. At this time, I ask that you please silence all cell phones and other devices. In the event of an emergency, accessible exits are located to the west side of the building behind me. There will be a question and answer session following the event, so please hold all questions until that time. During the question and answer session, we ask that you keep questions succinct so that everyone who wishes has a chance to ask their question. As a show of respect for our speaker and everyone in attendance, please stay until the end of the program, including the question and answer session. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that Dickinson is on the unceded lands of the Susquehannock Nation. We acknowledge the many Indigenous peoples that live with these lands, as well as the thousands of Indigenous children forced into Carlisle's Indian Industrial School starting in 1879 as a part of a federal cultural eradication effort. I created my first social media profile at the age of 11, definitely without my parents' permission. The internet helped me make friends, discover my interests, and even accept certain parts of my identity. I also believe that interacting with constant news cycles on social media contributed a great deal to my political identity. My experience resonates with journalist Barry James's analogy, quote, "The internet resembles a Wild West frontier town without a sheriff." And I have been mostly comfortable within this chaos, but since the 2016 election, the first one I really remember, I've been shocked by the increasing amount of hateful, dangerous ideas online. The amount of misinformation and harmful content being circulated concerns me greatly, and that is why I proposed today's event to my coworkers at the Clark Forum. I look forward to learning from our guests tonight about emerging strategies to combat these harms. Tonight, we are honored to host Professor Joshua Tucker. He is the Julius Silver, Rosalind S. Silver, and Enid Silver Winslow Professor at New York University. He is also NYU's Director of the Jordan Center for Advanced Study of Russia, co-director of the Center for Social Media, AI, and Politics, and a professor of politics. For over 10 years, Tucker has studied the intersection of the digital information environment, social media, and politics. Recently, he co-edited the book, Social Media and Democracy, The State of the Field, and he is also the co-chair of the external academic team for the 2020 US Facebook and Instagram election study. He serves on the advisory board of the Comparative Study of Electoral Systems and various other academic journals. He co-founded and co-edits the Journal of Experimental Political Science. He is also currently the co-chair of the American Political Science Association's Presidential Task Force on AI and Politics. Tucker is known for writing and editing the award-winning politics and policy blog, The Monkey Cage, hosted by The Washington Post. And for the past 2 years, Tucker has been recognized by Clarivate for top cited list for being in the top 1% of researchers cited in his field. And now please join me in welcoming Joshua Tucker.
Thank you so much, Bella, for your super kind introduction. Thanks to all the students who are participating in the Clark Forum. This has been a wonderful day. I was able to have lunch with the students and I've had opportunities to talk to them throughout the day. I'm flattered beyond belief that you would ask me to be here to come and talk to you today. Thanks to all of you for coming out at a late evening for this talk today, and I hope you'll find it interesting and maybe walk out of here with some different thoughts about things than you walked in here with. So as Bella said, my talk is titled Combating Online Harms, the Importance of Rigorous Scientific Testing of Proposed Interventions. Here's where the talk roadmap's going to go. I'm going to set my timer here so I don't go too long. And this is essentially, my pledge to you for what you're going to get out of this. I'm going to start off with a very brief overview of where we are at this moment in the study of misinformation, what Bella was talking about in terms of part of the motivation for why we wanted to have this event tonight. Then I'm going to move into the talk theme, which is the importance of rigorous testing of proposed interventions online before we implement those interventions and what we can learn from that rigorous testing. I will then, for a second, pay a homage, very quick homage, to the importance of observational data, which I think is crucially important. And indeed, the first 6 years that we spent working on this topic, we were primarily working with observational data. But then I'm going to spend the bulk of the talk walking you through 3 intervention studies that I've been honored to be a part of. 2 of them are from CSMAP, and the last one is from this US 20 Facebook and Instagram election study. So what I'm going to talk to you about is one intervention where we looked at the effect of searching for information online when assessing the veracity of news. We're going to look at a second study that we did looking at the effect of source credibility rankings when you were encountering information online. And then finally, we're going to get to, I think, where we started with all this, the importance of algorithmic changes in the way that content is delivered on social media. I'll end with a very brief look forward to LLMs and generative AI. The students who spent time with me know today I've been thinking a ton about generative AI, but I'm just going to briefly nod to that at the end of the talk, and then I'll say a word about data access going forward. All right, so we have been studying as Bella mentioned, 2016 is when misinformation sort of burst into the collective consciousness of Americans in particular. Now, it had been in other people's collective consciousness before 2016, but that's when it really sort of hit most people became aware of it, most people kept talking about it. With the discovery of these kind of fake news websites in sense of these websites that were pretending to be news outlets that weren't, and they were actually being run by Macedonian teenagers and all sorts of different things like that. So we know a bunch of things, and the focus of this talk is not going to be on misinformation, but we know a bunch of things about misinformation at this point in time that we didn't know in 2016. And these are some general observations of sort of like where the research community has landed on this. The first is that much like everything else on the internet, exposure to misinformation, production of misinformation, sharing of misinformation is characterized by power laws. And I know there might be a mathematician in here who's going to tell me I'm using the term power laws the wrong way, but essentially the curves that look like this. So what we have is we have small numbers of people that are getting very high doses and large numbers of people that are actually getting very low doses. And if you don't believe this and you think that misinformation is ubiquitous and most people aren't getting low doses, what I would push you to do is after this talk is over, go open your social media app of choice, scroll through 30 or 40 posts and tell me how many of those you think are actually abject misinformation. And for most of you, it's going to be an extremely low number. The second thing we know about misinformation is that, and apropos what we were talking about during the podcast, was there are ideological asymmetries in this. That exposure to misinformation, and I'll show you a figure of this in a moment, but that exposure to misinformation online and on social media platforms has been higher on the right than it has been on the left. That's a fairly consistent pattern cross-nationally, although I wouldn't say that it was completely consistent. And so that complicates things more, because the existence of misinformation is not something that's simply uniformly spread across the political spectrum, and I'll show you some data on that in a second. We also know that, and again, building on the power laws, that for a vast majority of people, misinformation is a very low percentage of people's information diet. And that this, relative to the amount of oxygen that misinformation has gotten in the sort of public zeitgeist, it's actually a much smaller part of people's information diet. And so researchers have begun to sort of move away from thinking about misinformation per se to thinking more about online harm And my colleague Jennifer Allen at the Center for Social Media, AI, and Politics at NYU has an amazing piece in Science where she actually shows through looking at the spread of news headlines on Facebook and then looking at running a whole series of over 100 different experiments exposing people to news headlines on Facebook, that the headline that caused the greatest amount of vaccine hesitancy was not actually misinformation. It was a headline that said something to the effect of, "Doctor gets COVID shot and dies 2 weeks later." And it was published in the Chicago Tribune. And it was absolutely true. A doctor had gotten a COVID shot and she had died 2 weeks later. Of course, it had nothing to do with causation, but that particular headline spread like wildfire during the pandemic on Facebook. It wasn't misinformation. It probably caused a lot of harm. And then with all of this going on, there has been a tremendous amount of effort in the research community to propose interventions. This has come from civil society, this has come from researchers, this has come from academics. There's lots of interventions to try to make it either that people are exposed to less misinformation online, that people share less misinformation online, or that people conditional on being exposed to it are more likely to correctly assess whether or not it's true. Lots of these have been proposed, lots have been implemented. Along with this, in the United States, misinformation has become a heavily politicized topic. And part of the reason that it's become a heavily politicized topic is to some extent, and Bella and I talked about this in the podcast earlier today, in some extent this was an inevitability given the ideological asymmetries. Because if you have platforms that are attempting to act against misinformation, and the sort of high water mark of this was during the pandemic around 2020, and then during the events in the aftermath of the 2020 election, when you have platforms trying to act on misinformation, and that misinformation has ideological asymmetries to it, if you say to someone who's not in mathematics, not a social scientist, if you talk about whether a policy is biased or not, to most people, that means, well, is it fair? And does it mean, is it fair? That would mean like, well, if it's not politically biased, you should be acting on 50% of content from the left, 50% of content from the right. But due to these ideological asymmetries, actually having a non-politically biased content moderation policy doesn't mean that you're removing 50-50 unless you happen to get lucky and the production is 50-50. It means you're not paying attention to the politics when you're actually removing content. And the result of this is that misinformation got very politicized in the United States, and it became equated with censoring voices on the right. And I'm not going to speak to whether that's a correct characterization or not, or an incorrect characterization. What I just want to point out here is that this led to it becoming highly politicized, right? And when President Trump returned to office, if anyone was watching the executive orders as they came out that first night after he got inaugurated, one of those orders prohibited research on misinformation and federal funding on research on misinformation. So the very concept of misinformation became politicized, and also research on misinformation became politicized. And it's something, for example, that anyone who works in this field knows you cannot put the word misinformation now in an application to the National Science Foundation. So that's kind of where we are with misinformation. In some respects, I think we spent too much time as a discipline focusing on it. On the other hand, it's a very difficult area in which to be doing research at this point in time, or at the very least to be doing federally funded research. All right, so I'm going to give you a heuristic here for thinking about misinformation and thinking about the kind of research we can do. So you might think that there are sort of like three big questions about misinformation. There's who gets exposed to it, who believes it, and who shares it. And we can think about research happening on all of these different causal arrows, like conditional on exposure, who believes it? Conditional on belief, who shares it? Does sharing misinformation make you more likely to believe it? And then one of the most interesting ones, which I originally didn't think was happening, but that you can go straight from exposure, not care whether or not you believe it, and actually go straight to sharing. And I'm not going to show you the results from this paper today, but one of our most famous papers from our lab is our paper showing that older people were actually much, much more likely to share misinformation in 2016 than younger people were. But that's a question about sharing. All right. We can also think about happening around this misinformation ecosystem. We can think about questions about production, who's producing misinformation, which then goes and impacts exposure. And then we can think about downstream effects. Does it affect polarization? Does it affect trust in media? All right. So this is a kind of universe for thinking about different types of the way that the misinformation ecosystem kind of fits together. And you can think about places where interventions that you might propose to break some of these links could sit and where you could test them. All right. So I said lots and lots of interventions have been tested. I'm not kidding about this. You can read huge reviews on terms of all these different interventions. Loosely put, and I got to thank Ziv Sanderson, who was the previous executive director of my center, now is not there anymore, and he went to go work for Google. But Ziv, I had a much more convoluted version of this slide, and he was like, actually, use these categories. And these are the 4 categories, and I think they're very useful. We can think of educational interventions. So interventions that act on people to make them better able to ascertain the veracity of information. We can think about like digital literacy tests, like maybe some of you had those in high school probably who are here. We can think about fact checking, we can think about warnings, we can think about source credibility labels, and we can think about searching for information. We can also think about technological interventions, right? So if educational interventions are trying to act on people, and in some ways these are the least controversial because they don't involve anyone coming in and saying what's true and what's not. They just involve giving individuals better tools to do this on their own. But we can also think about technological interventions where we have algorithmic changes. And for anyone who says there should be no content moderation, right, we know there has to be content moderation, right? Child pornography is illegal in this country. All platforms act when anybody tries to share child pornography online. That is a technological intervention, right? They all have screens to do this, and and so these are forms of content moderation. So that's technological interventions. We do this on illegal content. You could also do technological interventions on try to reduce people's exposure to misinformation. We can also think of social interventions. Letitia Bode, who's at Georgetown, has done some really interesting research on this, where when you have health misinformation online, and instead of having a professional fact check on that information, you have another person who offers a correction. So that's like a social correction. And then finally, David Rand and Gord Pettycook, now who are both at Cornell University, have been very big in terms of these kind of psychological interventions. And there's they worked on these sort of accuracy nudges, which were sort of studies where you reminded people about the importance of accuracy before you showed them information. Other people have looked at pre-bunking, which is to try to, almost like a vaccine, you try to expose people to the existence of misinformation before they actually encounter it in the wild. So there's just a huge set of these different types of interventions that are floating around there, and they all sound pretty good. Otherwise, they wouldn't have sort of made it onto this list. So my key takeaway tonight, what I hope you'll walk out of here remembering, if you remember one thing, is that just because an intervention sounds good conceptually doesn't mean it will have the impact that we think it will. And the solution to this is to make sure we rigorously test these interventions before we run around and write them up in op-eds and say that they're the next big thing and that the platform should all adopt them and that everybody should do X. The same rigor that we tried to take to medical science, we should really take to information sciences in this way. And so the rest of the talk is going to be some interesting findings from some of the rigorous testing of interventions that I've been able to work on over the last few years. And they've kind of been really interesting sets of results for me. All right, so what am I going to show you? I'm going to show you 3 studies. They are going to draw on these. 2 of them are going to draw on educational interventions. The first one I'm going to show you has to do with searching online for information. Then I'm going to show you something about source credibility. I'll explain what that means. And then the last one, I'll tell you about this incredible project that Bella was kind enough to mention that I've had the professional opportunity of a lifetime to be involved with for the last six years, which is kind of crazy, called the US 2020 Facebook and Instagram election study, where we really had a chance to study the effect of algorithms. And I'll explain to you how we did that. OK, so the importance of, I want to just quickly say, I'm going to talk about experimental research. It's not meant to denigrate observational research. I've done a ton of observational research. It's super important in the information environment. With AI, we're at the observational research stage where we were with social media 12 years ago, where we don't know anything that's happening, and we've got to do a ton of observational research. But this is the study I was telling you about ideological asymmetry. So these are URLs that were identified by Facebook's third-party fact-checker program. So not by us as the researchers. Facebook's third-party fact-checker program, which involved taking suspect URLs, sending it out to all sorts of different fact-checking organizations. These are the audiences of the URLs. And what you see here is just that these audiences are overwhelmingly on the right. Right? So this is the kind of things you can learn from observational data. This is my colleague Jenny Allen's work, where she showed, they did this incredible sort of tracking data where they looked at people's media consumption, and they looked at TV consumption that was not news, mobile consumption that was not news, desktop consumption that was not news. Then you get into TV news, then you get into mobile news, then you get into desktop news. Then you get into false news, and you see this really tiny red line at the top here. That's the amount of misinformation. So when we say it's a low part of people's information diet, that's because it's a low part of people's information diet. It doesn't mean there aren't individuals for whom it's a higher part of their individual diet, but but for most people, it's an extremely low part of their information diet. So this kind of observational data is incredibly important. It's incredibly important for getting a sense of what's happening at scale. This is all I'm going to show you with observational data for now. So instead, I'm going to spend the rest of the time here, the next half hour, talking to you guys about 3 different sets of experiments. Okay, so the first one is we're going to look at the effect of online searching, and I want to credit Kevin Aslett, who was the lead author on this particular paper, who was a postdoc at CSMAP. This appeared in Nature in 2024. And this is going back to this framework that I gave you before. Here we're going to look at this difference between conditional on being exposed to misinformation, who believes it. And we're going to try to see what happens when we run an intervention post-exposure as people are updating beliefs. All right, so what's the motivation for this particular research is that, and this is kind of the motivation for the whole talk, really, about the importance of doing these rigorous evaluations, is that if you've ever seen any of these kind of digital media literacy tips, they all say something like this: look at other information, or verify an unlikely story by finding a reputable outlet reporting the same finding. Okay? I'm going to come back to that reputable outlet later, but these kinds of things, searching for more information about things that you're not sure if they're true, these are all over digital literacy tips. But the reality of the situation is we talk about the evils of social media. Now we're talking about the evils of AI. We don't really talk about search engines enough. And yet search engines, until AI completely overtakes them, and I'll get back to that at the end of this, but search engines are used all the time by everybody. And in fact, more than 50% of internet users state that they check facts they come across with search engines at least once a day. And internet users trust search engines more than traditional news, such as radio, newspapers, or television. But we don't actually, or we didn't before we published this article, have any sense of what the effect of searching for information online was on people's ability to correctly identify the veracity of news. And so that's what we set out to study. So first, what's the effect of searching online for information about a news article on one's ability to correctly identify the veracity of that news article? Is it true or is it false? And then the second question, which I'll get to at the end of this section, is what's the effect of exposure to unreliable or low-quality news in this process? This was our counterintuitive, pre-registered hypothesis for a bunch of theoretical reasons that revolves around something called data voids, which is this basic idea that for certain types of misinformation, there's actually not corresponding true information out there, and so the internet ends up with what's called a data void, where the only stuff out there in this particular area. So that's what motivated our theoretical argument. But this is basically, we argue that searching online would actually increase the incorrect belief that false news stories are true. All right, so how do we go about studying this? For this project, we ran 5 separate studies. And we did this in a couple of different ways, a bunch of different ways. So in the first 2 studies, we measured directly after an article was published whether or not searching online for information about it. And I'll explain to you how we did it in a second. But the first 2 studies were directly after misinformation was published, like within 24 hours after it was published, what happened. Then, because we were getting results back from that were interesting, and we thought, well, maybe it had something to do with the fact that this was right after the stories were published. So then we reran the study again with using misinformation, or I'll explain in a second, using news months after it was published. And then because when you do this sort of thing, and I'll explain how we got the articles in a second, you get some really random, weird kind of stuff in there. Then we thought, well, maybe this is because we're not looking at like what is known as high salience. So we ran our fourth study, again, going back to directly after stuff was published, but we limited ourselves to information that was incredibly salient by doing this in May of 2020 and limiting ourselves to news articles about COVID. And then our final study, which I'll come back to in a second, was how does search information quality affect belief in misinformation? All right, so what was our research design? I said we have a rigorous design to try to get at causal relationship here. So the basic idea of their goal was to remove researcher discretion from this process as much as possible. There's lots and lots of studies out there about people's ability to correctly identify news headlines, to correctly identify whether news stories are true. But in almost all of those studies, besides the work that we've done, it's either A, the researchers make up the news themselves, or B, the researchers choose the headlines or choose the news stories to include. And usually they go to something like PolitiFact or FactCheck or .org, one of these places that fact check things, and they take a bunch of those studies. We didn't want to do that. And so our goal was to remove researchers from the process as much as possible on this selecting of articles. The second thing that we wanted no business of was us deciding which of these news stories were true and which of these news stories were false. So we hired 5 professional fact checkers to look at each of these news stories and to ask them if they thought the central claim of the story was false or it was true. That then became our ground truth. And so what we would do is we would come up with, to avoid us being the ones who chose the articles, we set up a predefined set of streams. We had 5 streams, which, and here's our visualization of it. These 5 streams, we had left-leaning mainstream news, right-leaning mainstream news, then we had left-leaning low-quality news, right-leaning low-quality news, and then we had low-quality news that we actually really couldn't tell whether it was left-leaning or right-leaning because it was all over the place or it was just sort of on nutso stuff. And we took lists from other people to compile these lists. And so what we did was every day of the study, we would go to each one of these 5 streams and we would grab the most popular article that had appeared in the last 24 hours. We would take those articles and then we would send them to our professional fact checkers to get our ground truth. And we would send them to about 90 people a day. And we asked those 90 people to evaluate 3 articles each. And so in that way, we accumulated over the course of the study lots and lots of different articles. All right, then this is the point, this is the part where we get to the rigorous study here, which this is called a randomized control trial. And what we essentially did in these studies was we had a control group, which we asked to just evaluate the news story. Do you think it's true, false or misleading, or can't tell? And then in our treatment group, we had them search online to find more information about it and then evaluate the study as true, false, or misleading, or couldn't tell. We used what's known as a within subjects design for a bunch of these studies where we had people evaluate it themselves, then go online and look for it, and then reevaluate it. We also used for some of these studies what's called a between subjects design, where we just randomly assigned half the people to never go online and the other half to go online. Okay, so the difference then between these two is the effect of searching online. This is basically the whole framework of experimental analysis here, that we assume our control group and our treatment group is essentially similar, except for what we've had them do differently. And of course, in the within subjects design, it's literally the same person, only they've now done something else. Okay, what do we find? I've been doing these kind of experiments for a long time. I have never seen results as consistent as this. Basically, across all 4 of these studies, and remember, these are within subjects, between subjects, right after they're published, 3 months after they're published. This last one is limited to COVID-19 stories, right, which was like the most salient thing in May of 2020. We got the exact same finding. It was like a 20% increase in people's incorrect belief that false news stories were true. Or, to put it more precisely, news stories that our professional fact checkers assessed that the central claim of these stories was indeed false or misleading. 20%, there was a 20% increase in the likelihood that people would think those stories were true if they searched online for more information. So we found searching online increases the belief that people believe that false news stories are true. And this is directly after publication, whether you use within subjects, between subjects, months after publication, or when limited to a highly salient event like COVID. So our second question was, what was driving this, right? Because if you think about it, there's essentially kind of like two potential stories that are out there that could drive this. One, I learned from talking, as these results came in, we kept getting more and more surprised by their consistency. And so we kept telling more people and giving more talks about this. And so I talked to a social psychologist named Jeff Hancock out at Stanford, and he said, oh, what you're probably capturing here is the truth bias. There's an evolutionary benefit to trusting people that has evolved in human beings. And just by asking people to do more things, they're becoming more trusting. The other alternative theory is what I loosely called in the lab, the internet is full of junk theory, which was, no, it has something to do with what's coming back, inspired by this data void theory from the searches. And so what was nice about the distinction between the truth bias and the internet is full of junk theories is that there was an observational difference. If it was the truth bias, we shouldn't see a difference based on the quality of the search results that came back. If it was the internet full of junk, we should see a difference in it. So we went and ran another study, and in this particular study, we got participants to enroll, and they had a browser extension put on that let us track where they went to look for information online and what happened when their search results came back in. What was the quality of those news sources? We used something called NewsGuard, which I'll introduce you to in a second, to to assess the quality of those news sources. So we weren't involved with this at all, used outside rankings of this. But basically what we found is that the effects we were identifying were being driven by people whose searches came back with at least 10% of their URLs that Google was sending back were from unreliable sources. And when you got back only really reliable sources, there didn't seem to be this pernicious effect. Now, let me be clear. There was no benefit. It wasn't like you actually became better able to correctly identify false news as false, but at least it didn't have this pernicious effect. And this is just a different way of breaking up the data. Okay, so the takeaway from the first paper. Searching for information about false news stories paradoxically increases belief in misinformation, despite all this advice in these things to go out and search for information online when you're unsure. Why? Our best guess is because search engines return low quality information. When does this happen? I didn't show you this in the slides. I'm going to do a bunch of papers, so I'm not doing the full thing. But it turns out that you're likely to get more likely to get these low quality results coming back when you engage in lazy searching, which is just copying and pasting the headline or the URL, which makes sense from the vantage point of the economics of the low information news environment, which is if you're going to build a bogus website and do bogus reporting, to try to get clicks, you might as well do it 30 times. And so that might be something that's going on there. And actually didn't show you this, but who engages in lazy searching? People with lower levels of digital literacy. Although I'll come back to that in 1 second. Interestingly enough, in results I didn't show you, which makes this more complicated, searching for information also increases belief that true news stories are true. So just like everything, it's complicated. And the implication on search advice is complicated. And what I think is the big question is, if you remember those digital literacy interventions I showed you at the beginning. They didn't just say, do your own research, right? Although, if you recall, the phrase, do your own research, that was QAnon's line, right? That's their tagline, do your own research, right? So that begins to make a little more sense here. It was, in those digital literacy things, they were telling people, go look at a high quality source. And what I've shown you is these results kind of come about when people get low quality sources. So I think one really important thing, if you're going to give people advice to go out and look for information, is whether they hear that part about high quality sources. But don't forget, high quality sources are also in the eye of the beholder. Different people think different types of sources are high quality. We've done other interesting research on that as well. But what this clearly has is implications for search quality, which comes back to the content moderation question, right? Clearly, these results suggest that if Google was more picky in the types of sources that it returned when people were doing these searches, these pernicious effects might go away. We don't know that for sure. We haven't seen that. And that led to our next research project, which I'm just going to tell you about really briefly, which is, of course, what about AI? Because when we were writing this, no one was talking about search. But now, all of a sudden, everybody is talking again about AI and the possibility of AI replacing search. And so we have a big line of research that's ongoing right now about trying to look at what happens when people are trying to assess the veracity of information, and instead of going to traditional search engines, they go to AI search engines. So this is the first paper that's come out of this. This is a paper that hopefully I will read on the train back to New York tomorrow, and then we'll send out to a journal later this week. But what we did in this paper was, instead of having just the 2 treatment arms, just reading the article and searching on Google, we added a 3rd treatment arm. Just reading the paper, searching on Google, searching using AI. Now, we did this about 18 months ago, and for various reasons in terms of what was feasible at the moment, we used Perplexity. Now, Perplexity was not a bad choice in retrospect, because Perplexity is what's called a RAG, in that it's retrieval augmented generation. It goes out and searches for information on the internet, and all these other models have become more RAG-like in the intervening time. That being said, not a ton of people use Perplexity, so take this with a grain of salt. These are also models that are 18 months old at this point, or even more. And so what we found was that, well, so first off, the annoying thing, I mean, it's like a good thing as a scholar and it's an annoying thing as a human being. We completely replicated our Google findings again. When people search for Google, they became more likely to believe these false stories. And this is crazy, because we literally presented the results of this study to the Google search team after we did it. And it still doesn't seem to have made any difference. What we found for Perplexity is that it was bad, unfortunately, and I was really thinking that maybe these AIs, because they didn't have the overt level of politicization where you didn't just see what sources they were choosing on, that perhaps they were being more selective in the sources they were drawing on, because AI is really, their business model is about getting things right, that this would actually be better. It turns out it's a little bit better than Google, but it's still having the pernicious effect. So it's having the pernicious effect. It's not having quite as pernicious an effect as Google, and these are not actually probably statistically distinct from one another. So take that with a grain of salt. But anyway, we have a much wider range of research where we're going to be doing this with different types of search engines, different types of models, and doing it with Google with their search summaries, with their AI summaries turned on, and Google with their AI summaries turned off. So stay tuned for more things on that. Okay, so the future research, we're going to do this with more models. We're also going to expand the amount of media we've been doing. We had people just looking at text articles. We're also going to do videos like TikTok. And then another thing that we're super excited about is we're actually going to move away from this task of identifying whether an article is true or not, and just look at people's unstructured searching as people move from Google to AI, and see what kind of information this returns. So that'll be more observational. Okay. All right, so that's the first study. Second study. This one will be a little bit quicker. The second study is also with lead author Kevin Aslett from CSMAP. We wanted to know what was the effect of these source credibility labels. And if you remember, this got a lot of attention a few years ago as kind of the next big thing, that we were going to, instead of just having people search for news generally and go through the internet or go through social media, we would rely on one of these types of fact-checking organizations that would provide source credibility labels while you were browsing. So what does that mean? Well, what did we know? We know source credibility information is a relatively weak intervention for correcting misinformation, but we know showing source information can improve one's discernment of true and false information. This latter one actually comes from the same pipeline as the Nature paper, where we ran an experiment where instead of having people search online, we showed them a news story with and without the name of the news organization. All right, so what we don't know is behavioral outcomes or the downstream consequences of getting these kind of source credibility labels. So we ran another randomized control trial where essentially what we did was we recruited people into the study. We had a first wave survey, then we started collecting browser data. So people installed an extension. We collected what websites they visited when they were before the study started. And then we randomly assigned people to get one of these source credibility label tools. Half of our control didn't and then half of the people in the study did, and they got what was known as NewsGuard, and then we surveyed them afterwards. So it's a classic randomized control trial. People are basically the same, except some people get NewsGuard, some people don't. What's NewsGuard? NewsGuard is a ratings organization that basically is willing to puts on, if you install the NewsGuard browser extension, you get a little green check for news sites that have a reliability rating of above 60. You get a red star for things that are unreliable. So what it looks like is when you have a search engine result like Google results. This is from CNN, it gets a green check. This is from CNN, it gets a green check. This is from welovetrump.com. It ends up getting a red label because it's not a legit news organization. This also shows up in your social media feeds. It also shows up in your browser extension here. It also shows up on Facebook. All right. So our hypotheses were that actually having these source credibility labels would lead people to have healthier diets. They would spend less time once they started getting these credibility labels going to sites that were lower rated. Okay, what did we find? We found very limited effects. These are not statistically significant effects. They're not statistically significant where we pre-registered them. It's average reliability scores. It's sort of in the right direction, but it's not statistically distinct from zero. At the advice of a reviewer, we actually broke people down into folks that the quality of their media diet from before the study started. And we broke them down into deciles. And these deciles were the percentage of, based on the percentage of low quality news sites that people were visiting before the study started. And one thing again on the power laws, you'll note we broke them into deciles, but even in the sort of 60th decile, people are still going to basically 90% of the sites they're going to is high quality. When we get out to the people in the bottom 10th decile or the second two smallest deciles, which are people who are beginning to go to like 20% to 15 to 20% of low quality news sources before it starts, then we begin to see a little bit of an effect. So it does look like that possibly these source credibility labels improved the browsing behavior of people who had the lowest quality news diets before the study started. We also looked at a whole bunch of different downstream effects around media trust, around democratic dysfunction, around misperceptions, and the hope that like having higher quality media diets would lead people to have better outcomes on these other downstream effects that we care about. There was no evidence of any of this. Nothing seemed to get better just because people were using these source credibility labels. So what does that mean? You know, unfortunately, what we basically found was no robust or consistent effects on news diet quality on average. Suggested evidence that credibility labels do change news consumption among those with the lowest average diet. So some suggestive evidence. We didn't pre-register that. We looked at it because a reviewer said it, so take it with a grain of salt. And we couldn't identify any downstream effects. So our second intervention made a ton of sense, seemed like it should make a lot. It was getting a lot of attention, and yet when we rigorously tested it, it didn't seem to have much of an effect. All right. Our takeaways from this is that these subtle contextual information, you know, if it sounds too good to be true, maybe it is too good to be true, right? And in this case, just having a little shield, a little green dot, a little red dot popping up doesn't really seem to have changed people's experiences on the internet. And the argument here, and this is like a thing that kind of goes back to the very beginning of my talk when I was talking about the importance of these power laws. One of the implications of this is that future research should really try to target these harder to reach populations that are in the tails of these distributions. But that's tricky because those are often people who don't want to participate in research studies, and it's more expensive to find them. Okay, the final thing I'm going to show you about here is algorithmic changes. And this one we're going to switch gears. Instead of looking at belief and misinformation, we're going to look at the effect of algorithmic changes on political polarization, on levels of polarization. The results that I'm going to show you here are going to draw on 5 papers, 5 different experiments that we ran as part of the US 2020 Facebook and Instagram election study project. Three of these papers appeared in, two of these papers appeared in Science in the summer of 2023. One appeared in Nature in the summer of 2023. This one, the PNAS one, appeared in 2024. And this Nature Human Behavior one came out like 3 days ago. So that's hot off the presses here. So I'm going to show you results from these 5 different studies. One thing, before I start, I want to say just a couple words about the US 2020 Facebook and Instagram election study project. This was a first of its kind ever large-scale collaboration between a team of external academic researchers, which I had the unbelievable privilege to co-chair this team, along with Professor Talia Stroud of the University of Texas, Austin. We put together a team of 17 academics. We were joined by another dozen academics on particular projects. We then worked collaboratively with researchers at Meta to design and implement a series of studies around the US 2020 election. These projects truly took a village to pull off. The fact that we were able to collaborate with Meta means that for these experiments I'm going to show you, these are not things we did in a lab. These are not things we did with browser extensions. We actually changed people's experiences for consenting participants on the platform who chose to participate in these studies. We also got to measure, I'm not going to show you now, but like that Gonzalez-Bayon et al. One, which also came from this project that I showed you earlier, was measuring the entire adult US population on Facebook. This partnership began in early 2020. I said all that, blah, blah, blah. The scope of the project was the role and impact of Facebook and Instagram in the context of the US 2020 elections. We have a publicly posted FAQ that you can find lots and lots more details about this project. I will note we were, of course, aware of the fact that this was a dicey situation, that we were collaborating with people who worked for a platform in order to study that platform. The reason we did this is because this permitted us to run studies that would otherwise have been impossible without the collaborations of the platform, and to get access to data that would otherwise have been impossible to get access to for these studies. And the studies are all jointly co-authored with our Meta research team. Given this situation, we thought long and hard at the beginning of the project, which, mind you, this started in February 2020. We had to put the whole thing together before the 2020 election. So we got everybody who agreed to do this, and then the global pandemic hit like 4 weeks later, and everybody's lives were completely upended. But while that was all going on, we were thinking really seriously about this. So we took all sorts of different steps to try to ensure the integrity of this research. So that included pre-registering these studies. This is when you say before you collect any of the data what it is you are going to do in your analyses. We had a red line of the academic researchers, but we were going to walk from the project if Facebook asked for pre-publication approval. So we had no pre-publication approval from Facebook other than to check the papers to see if there was any legal or privacy obligations that the papers violated. And I will say, I have plenty of complaints about this, but I will say they have been in this process where we have done this legal and privacy review now across like 14 papers. They came back to us with one thing that literally had to do with like the number of digits that we had gone out to in one number. And so that's been exemplary. That hasn't had to do anything. We also came up with something which I would recommend as an incredible model for anyone who ever thinks about this kind of industry collaboration, which is that we established the precedent that the academic lead authors on each paper had control rights. So one of the things about 30 or 40 people on a paper is how do you decide who makes the final decision? We had a very small academic team that had the right for final decisions on this. We had a project rapporteur. We had someone who was not involved with the academic team, but who has followed this as kind of like an anthropological study throughout the whole period of time. And the data is all available for anyone to apply to work with to do replication studies and extension of what we've done. Okay, so in these, the final thing I'm going to show you tonight has to do with political polarization. So this is another, we've been talking about misinformation so far tonight, but this is another big bugaboo of what people think about social media. We have seen a massive rise of what I would call affective polarization in the United States over the last 20, 25 years. As a political scientist, I teach a whole lecture on this. But essentially, issue polarization is how far people are apart on issues, how far parties are apart on issues. And affective polarization is how much you dislike supporters of the other party. That could be candidates, that could be party members, that could be voters of the other party. We examine the effect of social media on both of these. This has been rising tremendously in this country, throughout the world, but a lot, especially in the United States. And so political polarization is essentially, for those of you not familiar with the term before 2 minutes ago, it's the level of division in a political system. Okay, so I'm going to show you results now. We ran 5 different experiments to try to get at all sorts of different theorized and hypothesized mechanisms by which social media exacerbates political polarization. So the first had to do with the algorithm. So we have all heard this term over and over again, engagement maximizing algorithms. Algorithms that are intended to keep you on the platform. It's how the platforms make money. It's how they monetize. These are ad-based platforms. And people have suggested, including in congressional testimony, that Facebook's harmful effects would be mitigated if we got rid of this engagement maximizing algorithm. So getting rid of an algorithm, you can't just get rid of an algorithm, you have to replace it with something else. So what we did in our first study was we went back to the algorithm that was originally used on these platforms when they first emerged, which is something called reverse chronological feed, which is you see the most recent post by one of the people you have chosen to follow, and you see the most recent post by them, and then the next most recent, the next most recent, the next most recent. Nothing is being altered because of what the algorithm thinks you're interested in. So that's called reverse chronological feed. Another big thing we've heard about social media is virality, that the posts that go viral and that contributes to political polarization. So to try to get at virality, our second intervention was to randomly assign people to not see, and these are over 6-week periods leading up to the campaign and leading up to the election, to not see any reshared content, because that's the most viral, that's the way content. It doesn't perfectly do this. I could post something and then Bella could see it on my page and copy and paste it and post it on her page, and then it might show up on somebody else's page, but it does cut out a lot of it. So we have a second randomized control pile for people who don't see reshared content. Then the next big bugaboo, echo chambers. We talked a lot about this in the podcast interview earlier today. This is a big hypothesis that the way social media causes political polarization is by putting people in echo chambers. That's a empirically testable proposition, but the argument is that these echo chambers contribute to polarization. So what we did was we tried to break people out of echo chambers by having a third treatment group where people saw less content from politically like-minded sources. So if you were liberal, we depressed the amount of content you saw from liberals. If you were conservative, we depressed the amount of content you saw from conservatives. The third was the presence of political ads. This is less theory-driven, but more just kind of empirically interesting, where we had a fourth treatment where people no longer saw political ads during the course of the campaign, and there were a couple different versions of this. On Facebook and Instagram, we removed all political ads. And on Facebook, we were also able to have targeted political ads. So some people had those removed. And then finally, we did a full deactivation study, which is, these 4 studies, my apologies, these go on for 3 months. We did a full deactivation study that went on for 6 weeks, where people just stopped using Facebook or stopped using Instagram. And we actually changed their feed that they were experiencing on the platform. So that's why this was like a first. This is the stuff the platforms do all the time. This is called A/B testing. They're doing it all the time internally, but we, the public, never get to see the results of these things, nor do we get to design them for scientific purposes. All right, the findings, none of these things had any effect on either affective polarization or issue polarization. So here's the results from reverse chronological feed. This is at Facebook, this is Instagram. Anything that you see straddling this line, the 0 line, is something that doesn't have a statistically significant effect, but these are basically 0. By the way, these are incredibly precisely estimated nulls because we had essentially over 20,000 people enrolled in each of these studies. The experiments I show you earlier are things with 200 people or 400 people or 2,000 people. So these are really, really precisely estimated nulls. This is for reshared content, same thing, where we get these average treatment effects that none of these, you need to be below 0.10 or 0.15 to be statistically significant. This is for echo chambers, really incredibly precisely estimated nulls. No effect of moving people out of echo chambers. This is removing the ads exposure. If anything, not having ads was increasing issue polarization, but again, these are all null effects. And then finally, we come to full deactivation, where people don't use them. this is the one place where we see some suggestive effect. Now, these are not statistically significant effects. And we also pre-registered. Remember, I told you about the integrity provision. So we pre-registered what we were going to do. And one of the things we said we were going to do was correct our statistical estimates for the fact that we were checking a large number of hypotheses. So these are the uncorrected effects. So this is suggestive that maybe going off Facebook and Instagram entirely led people to lower levels of affective polarization. But again, we pre-registered everything. This is not statistically significant at the pre-registered levels that we talked about. All right, tons of caveats about this, right? There was a lot of news when these studies came out, and Facebook PR and comms teams, I think, incorrectly generalized off of what these studies showed. There's lots of caveats in terms of generalization, although these are the first studies of their kind that we have. They're only in one country. It was during a heavily politicized campaign season. Maybe we would see different effects if we did it not during a situation where everyone was saturated with information. I will add, though, the fact that we did this during a political campaign is a feature of the study, not a bug. We were all motivated to do this because everybody came out of 2016 totally concerned that social media was having all of these effects during the 2016 election. And so when we had the opportunity to study this in 2020, we wanted to have a situation where we would know more about it. So this was designed to study this during an election, but it affects the generalizability. We have another paper that shows just how severe Facebook was involved in these kind of break the glass measures where they were depressing misinformation on the platform at different times during the election period. This was the 2020 election. It's not something they do anymore. We only had consenting participants. We only, other than that full deactivation, we only altered one aspect of the platform experience at a time. And of course, this is Facebook and Instagram. We don't know what would happen on TikTok. We don't know what would happen on YouTube. If you work for those platforms and want to run these studies with us, let me know. But so far, no one has come out of the woodwork to let us do this again. OK, so what can we not conclude? These experiments happened in a world where 15 years of social media had already existed. These experiments happened in a world where even with the people who were in our experimental treatment groups, everybody they knew was in the control group or wasn't on social media in the first place. We can't study the real counterfactual that everyone wants to know, which is, would we be a less polarized country if social media had never existed? So we don't know if no social media would mean less polarization. By the way, just as a funny note, when I typed into ChatGPT 4.0, what is a world, give me a picture of a world with no social media, apparently involves a lot of people sitting outside reading newspapers. So what can we conclude about it? In research that I haven't shown you here, because we are running short on time and I'm going to wrap up, Facebook does have a good deal of ideological segregation. A lot of news, I showed you one thing about that from earlier, is consumed primarily by liberals or conservative, but not by both. This is really driven by pages and groups. And people are getting much more content from ideologically like-minded sources. That paper that I showed you, the Nature paper, where we pushed people out of echo chambers, it also has a great observational data section to it where we go through this. And it's actually, people are getting a lot more content from ideologically like-minded sources, but most of it's not overtly political. But I think the bottom line from this is that, again, despite the fact that people were saying, oh, if we could just go to reverse chronological feed, everything will be better. If we just had fewer echo chambers, things would be better. We were hoping when we did these studies that we would come out of here with some sort of silver bullet, and we could tell the public, like, if you do X, turn off reshares 6 weeks before an election, and it will make things better. We didn't find any simple bullet-type solution to these really complex problems of high levels of ideological and affective polarization in the US. So is this a reflection of the complex nature of the information environment in the digital information era? Right now, I'm involved in a big cross-national 20-country study where we're actually trying to depress people's social media usage on all platforms. Maybe that will come up with different results, right? So maybe we were only looking at Facebook or Instagram, and maybe in a world where when you're not on, and one of the funny things, when we did that reverse chronological feed study, of course the treatment group ended up using it less. That's almost true by definition, because the other one's an engagement maximizing algorithm, so it's getting people to use it more. But do you know what happened to the people who used Facebook less? They just used Instagram more. Do you want to know who people who were in the Instagram study? They used TikTok more, right? So it might be that the information environment is just too complex to do any one sort of study to tease these things out. It might also be the reflection of that it's really hard to move attitudes around polarization, right? And that goes back to my prior point that like we don't know if there was no social media ever, would there be less polarization. It might be that by 15 years of accumulated social media, we've gotten to a point where there's so much polarization that it's just hard to move it with these kind of small treatments. But unfortunately, we don't have simple answers for complex problems. Okay, final things that I want to really tell you, two really quick points I want to make. One about AI, one about data. I think there are important lessons from having studied misinformation that we should be thinking about when we think about AI. And the takeaway here is that when we think about misinformation and AI, we can think about first-order concerns and second-order concerns. First-order concerns is what everybody gets most worked up about. And the first-order concern is that people will believe things that are not real and think they're true. And that's a serious problem. But some of what I've shown you tonight is that actually most people don't see a lot of stuff that isn't true. Some people see a lot of it. Most people don't. But what most people do see is a lot of people talking about the prevalence of things that aren't true. And that leads to a second-order concern. And the second-order concern is that if we all believe that these first-order problems are widespread, does it become hard to convince people that anything is true? And all you have to do is look at this sort of way in which the term fake news was appropriated by politicians to mean stuff I don't want to be true, right? I'm old enough to remember when fake news actually meant like literally a fake newspaper. Like the Denver Guardian did not exist. It was made up by some kid in Macedonia, right? But the term got appropriated, right? And I fear we are making the same mistake with AI all over again. Now, the AI thing may be much, much more serious, but the same problem emerges. If we live in a world where we are told videos can all be AI, images can all be AI, then how do we convince anybody that anything is true? So I think we need to think about that, and we need to think about that, how we address these first-order concerns, which are super real, without exacerbating the second-order concerns, which are also super important for democracy. I threw this slide in here. I think on the subject of AI, I've already talked about this with all of the students. I recently, for anyone who's interested in my thoughts on AI and social science research, just to throw this out here because it's 2026, I just published a piece in Brookings with my colleague Sal Messing about AI and social science research. So AI is not just coming for the political environment, AI is actually coming for how we do research and how we study it. And I'm not going to get into that now because I've got to stop talking. But the final thing I just want to say is that there are some studies that are possible without access to platform data. And there's a ton of creativity in the field about this. I love being part of this field because it's a never-ending cat and mouse chase. If you go back to when we started this in 2012, Twitter data was just totally available, and then Twitter data wasn't totally available, And there's so many creative researchers trying to figure out how to get access to data, how to run studies without the cooperation of the platforms. But many other things are not possible without getting access to this platform data. And the same thing holds for these AI models. AI models are amazing in terms of compared to social media. If we want to audit these AI models, their business model is to get people to use them, so we can audit them like crazy. But it's going to be even harder with the AI models to see how humans are interacting with them. Because at least Twitter and public Facebook and Reddit, we could see how humans interacted with each other. You interacting with an AI is not public data. Unless you donate that data to research, right, it's going to get harder and harder to see that. So, and the sad reality is, we are going to know much less about the impact of social media on the 2024 elections than we did on the 2020 elections, because we got this incredible opportunity in 2020. We had two goals, Talia and I, when we decided to devote a significant chunk of our lives to doing this. One was to make sure we knew way more about what happened in 2020 than in 2016. And in that way, I think we've been incredibly successful. The other hope was that we would show this research was possible and it would start to happen. And I wouldn't have to sit here today and say, well, the caveats are we only did this in one country and one election. We would be in 2026, we would say, hey, we've done this in 10 countries. And look, 5 different platforms and 6 elections. And these things are starting to happen. But nothing has. That aspect of it has been a total failure at this point in time because no other platforms have sort of jumped on board and been able to do these kinds of things. And so it's up to us as citizens to demand of our government that these platforms make this kind of research available, make this kind of research possible, make the data accessible, but also make the platforms themselves accessible for research. Because when we live in a world where there's 4 or 5 companies that are controlling information flows to billions of people globally, that's something that we as the public, I think, should be demanding that we know more about. And I will hope, when I leave out there this US 2020 model as what's possible. It was possible to do this. It took a ton of effort, it took a ton of money, and it took a lot of people working really, really hard, but it's possible. So we can't say, no, it's not possible. There's no way the platforms could open themselves up to externally designed research. And I suspect we are going to be saying the exact same thing about these AI companies for many years to come. So anyway, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for being here this evening. It's been a great pleasure, and hope you found it interesting.
Okay, now it is time for the question and answer session. Because this event is being recorded, please wait until the microphone reaches you to ask your question. We'll reserve the first questions for students and then open it up to the rest of the audience. It is now time for the first question.
Hi, thank you so much. That was really, really fascinating. I want to ask about specifically in Europe and other parts of the world where there have been more regulations put into place, and this might just be a matter of we don't currently have the data to know one way or another, but has that impacted, radicalization and polarization, or is that just unknown at this point?
Yeah, so I think if you look cross-nationally, there are different policies that are in place. What I was talking about on that last slide was regulations around data access for external researchers. That in itself is not going to affect political outcomes, but it is going to give us the ability to generate generalizable knowledge that policymakers can then use to inform regulatory choices. Like, we're a nonpartisan research lab at a university. We don't make any claims about anything being, we're not advocating for particular policies. The only policies we support is this kind of data access. So in Europe, they have put in something called the Digital Services Act, which supposedly has a pathway for researchers to get access to data. It is starting to make companies more transparent, slowly. And I think the devil is in the details on all of this, right? I think there's all sorts of contingencies here. And as Americans, we're sort of standing back and watching our European colleagues kind of do this. But it's a first step in that regard, right? And I think, the questions about the extent to which regulation is going to help things with regulation of social media is going to help polarization. Personally, I wonder how much the existence of social media as a bright, shiny new object has allowed us to divert attention from other fundamental structural questions that have led also to this rise of polarization, namely things having to deal with inequality and issues having to deal with policies around immigration, refugees, these kinds of situations. But I don't know the answer to that. I don't know the answer to that question. I think on the limited question, so I have no idea whether we can regulate out social media. The main things that I care about is having transparency around it so that we can learn what's actually happening on these platforms, so that if we are going to try to regulate interventions, they're informed by scientific evidence, as opposed to being just a good idea or something that's politically popular in a particular regard. I really wish we had found something in those studies. Like, the reshares one would have been great. That would have been like, if that actually brought the temperature down, that would have been awesome. We could have been like, turn off reshares for like 6 weeks before an election and people will be calmer. And, and maybe people could have done that, right? Like, but we didn't find any of that evidence. It's not the final word on it. There's some interesting studies. Now, in none of those studies did we act on content, right? So all we did things was at affordances of the platforms, which are characteristics of the platforms, like reshares or the algorithmic feed, or we acted at the account level. So there's another paper that's in progress now that still hasn't been published where we demoted content from untrustworthy sources. We demoted content in the one I showed you from politically like-minded sources. There's some really interesting research, 2 papers that just came out in Science and Nature, where people are now using LLMs and browser extensions together to re-rank content on the fly. And in this paper that just appeared in Science by Picardi et al., it's like just a month or two, a couple of months ago, they were showing that if you actually deprioritize polarizing content, now how you measure polarizing content is another question, that actually brought the temperature down a little bit. So we didn't try anything like that. So I'm excited about those kinds of studies, doing these things with browser extensions, because you don't need the cooperation of the platforms. And ideally, we'll be able to replicate, those have only been done on Twitter so far. But ideally, the tech will continue to get better and we'll be able to do this faster and faster and do it on other platforms as well. And thanks for the kind words, appreciate it. Yeah. We need a mic in the corner there. Or were you going to ask were you going to ask the next question? Is that that's one of the people carrying the mics, right? Yeah, no, okay.
First of all, thank you for coming. So my question sort of revolves around the LLMs and other social media companies that you didn't get to do research on. How likely do you think it's going to be that they will give their data over or will allow you that access in order to do the same type of research again?
Yeah, I think at this point, at this moment, to be able to do these kinds of studies is going to require regulation. But that regulation exists, right? Banks are required to do stress tests. There are literally people from the US federal government that sit in banks and have them run particular tests so that we know whether the bank is solvent, right? Like, this is not a totally unprecedented idea. I think before we did these studies, if you had said to somebody, oh, you should let a bunch of external researchers in who design studies that are important for informing policy, people would say, oh, it's not really possible. We've shown it is possible. I think you have to, I don't think, I don't know. I wanted people, when these papers came out, I wanted people to be like, oh, okay, that didn't, this was like a good thing to do. It's informing public policy. And the world didn't end because these studies were done. And we've tried talking to other platforms, and you hit walls in sort of doing these things. That being said, it's an incredibly resourceful community, and one of the exciting things that can happen is what's known as data donation. Now, data donation is problematic because you end up with a kind of skewed sample of people who are willing to donate their data to you. But one of the things, we wrote an op, any chance I get a chance to talk to regulators, I go to regulators and I'm like, look, we did this. You could require this. How would you, everyone's complaining that this is only one election. How would you like to see this again in 2028? You guys could mandate that the platforms do this. But I do think I think these browser extensions combined with LLMs is super, super exciting. We're building a new robust browser extension that for those new experiments we're going to do in the first paper I showed you, where we're going to have people go with ChatGPT and Claude and do all this kind of searching. And these browser extensions are going to collect, exactly what people type into the search, exactly what the search engines give back, what the LLMs give back to them, what sources they've delivered, what sort of things. So people are being, I think, very resourceful about this. The development of LLMs means that you can do this kind of experiments with content in browsers, which I think has been really hard to do in the past. But nothing is going to completely stand in for the fact that the platforms have access to this data and the public doesn't. Just to give it, in the early days of this, I mean, I wrote, you got to be careful what you ask for. We wrote this big review piece in 2017, and we were like, the big conclusion of this is like, because Twitter data is so accessible, researchers are doing all their research on Twitter, and they should really look at other platforms, right? And, fortunately, my lab, we started to do that. We did start looking at other platforms, but, and then we couldn't look at Twitter data anymore. So it's like, well, all right, that didn't work out so well, right? But because Musk bought the company and he made it too expensive for anybody to ever be able to afford to get access to this kind of data. But I do think data donations are one way. Like you do have the right to take your data out of TikTok, for example. You can take your data out of YouTube. We run surveys where we invite people to share this data with us, and I think that's kind of one way forward. I mean, one of the things we tried to do is we wrote an op-ed about this. I got a chance to talk to like a federal commissioner or something or other. What we were trying to push for was like, while these LLMs were so new, like ChatGPT and Claude and these things, that like they should build into the systems before they get so complicated, the ability to donate your data to science. Like if that was on like your checklist thing of when you're doing this, like would you be willing to donate your data to science? I mean, most people would say no. But like if 1% of people said yes, that would be an incredibly valuable resource. Now you ask anybody about that at Facebook and they're like, oh no, it's too complicated because people's data includes other people who haven't donated to this. But like LLMs, it's just like you and the LLM. Like if you give me that data, there's no privacy concerns that like you've inadvertently leaked your friend's data also. And so, we'll see what happens on it. But again, it's a resourceful community. And I think it's always been a kind of technological arms race in terms of like what's possible. And we've got a lot of interesting work going on at the lab involving a bunch of different platforms. And so we're gonna continue to do our best as long as we can in this world. Yeah.
We have time for two more questions.
Okay, we've got like, should I take a bunch of them at once or keep answering one at one? Okay, all right, we've got one here, two, and one there. I'll try to be quicker.
I was wondering, I know you discussed a bit earlier, like the politicization of misinformation and like who defines like what is misinformation. Other people think, like some people might think that something is misinformation, whereas other people might think that that's truth. And I was just kind of wondering, when it came to the fact-checking organizations and like websites that you guys used when selecting news, what did you have any considerations that you took when like considering the biases of those fact checkers?
Yeah, it's a great question. We were very excited that we managed to recruit a Republican professional fact checker for that study. But it's a serious question, right? Because you can just push this thing back further. Our sense was, from a scientific standpoint, we as researchers shouldn't be the ones who were saying whether things were true or not. And so we can be very precise, like, and I'm not saying it in this many words because I'm trying to be quicker and a good speaker, but like, what I showed you there was about the mode of a collection of professional fact checkers. These are people who get paid for a living to, and that's it. I'm not saying that's the absolute truth. Sometimes things that are true, that are the professional fact checkers think all aren't true, becomes true later, right? Like, so the best we can do is we can sort of, that's the approach we've taken. Now, the other question when we talk about high quality news versus low quality news, again, we don't try to rank those, and so that's why we've used NewsGuard, which gives these scores between 0 and 100. Look, NewsGuard, I mean, now here's the total sum of the politicization. NewsGuard has got accused of having anti-conservative biases, right? So it's gotten pulled into all of this. That being said, they're fairly transparent about what their components of their rankings are. Some of this stuff you might not agree with. Like, part of it is like, do you publicly list your board of trustees on your website, right? Like, but it's a bunch of things that are transparent. I mean, that is part of the reason, I think, why people have begun to say, enough with focusing purely on misinformation, and let's try to move the focus of the research to harm. So like, for example, the newest stuff that we're going to do with the AI stuff, like the things with all these AI models and people trying to correctly identify veracity, we are going to continue with this model of having a kind of ground truth that we don't pick. Now, we may move to LLMs, which that's a whole other subject of research, the extent to which LLMs have political biases, but you might expect that LLMs have fewer political biases than humans do, although big research question, and I'm not going to go out on that ledge right now. We have all sorts of other research about that, which I chose these papers to talk to you about tonight. But I do think, like, some of the stuff that we're going to be doing, some of the newer stuff, is going to be less about, like, oh, is it bringing back true or false information, in so much as, like, what's the ideological mix of the information. And we will talk about high quality versus low quality sources, which I think is a slightly, I mean, in some ways it's a little more charged, but in some ways it's putting less onus on someone to say this is truth, this is not truth, and just say, look, this is a low quality source. Why do you think it's a low quality source? It's a low quality source because X, Y, and Z rankings in the NewsGuard ranking. And if you disagree with that, we make our data publicly available. You can reevaluate it. Like, the names of the news sources are valuable. If you think that you have a different thing, you can rerun the analysis with that. So, but it's tough. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, that's why, what I wouldn't give for a world where, like, 50% of misinformation came from the left and 50% came from the right. I think it'd be a lot easier to study in that context, because you wouldn't have this political charge underneath it. But the reality is that's an unusual state of the world to develop. These things are often going to be, ideologically asymmetrical, depending on the context. Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for coming to our school. It means a lot. So my question is, have you researched or looked into why people are turning to AI and social media and the internet as opposed to, like, going to lectures in person or classes or reading and things like that?
So the short answer is no. We are doing some things of looking into some of the consequences of that. And we have interesting research in that regard, trying to look at different belief systems that are politically consequential of people who are valuing offline relationships versus online relationships. But I think this question of, why people are turning to social media, why people are turning to AI, there's so many interesting research questions to be asking about this. I mean, mind-blowing stuff around AI. And I was telling people we were having lunch with today, I was at this conference last summer and I saw my first paper on people who were involved in romantic relationships with AIs, and, like, who were freaking out when the AI models got updated because they felt like their partner had disappeared because they got rebooted to a new. I mean, like, there's so much interesting stuff to study, and even in the world of social media, there's so much interesting stuff to study. Our lab has decided that the best thing we can do is kind of be in our lane of politics. Like, we're an interdisciplinary lab, but we're, like, centered around political questions. And I think the questions that you're posing here are a little more psychological and a little more sociological. But I do think I will leave you with those of you who are interested in this as a research topic. I do think that, like, one of the things that we are going to find ourselves, everyone has trashed social media a ton, but it is products that were used by billions of people globally, so people were getting something out of it. And I think we're going to lament a little bit the loss of the social nature of social media as people spend more and more time conversing with chatbots, right? There was already a story about your generation that you were spending less time socializing with your peers in person than my generation did, because we didn't have, the internet when I was kids, or social media or anything like that. And I think the next generation, we're going to be like, they're not even on social media being mean to each other, right? Like, they're just talking to AIs by themselves. And so I think that that's something that's worth watching, that there was a social component to social media. There's positives and negatives to social interaction. And I'm actually involved with a new effort at NYU that's really interdisciplinary, bringing together, like, cognitive scientists, people who do games for education, that's starting to really think about how you can design AI technology in a way to build social connections. as opposed to in a way that's going to continue exacerbating this trend of people interacting one-on-one with AI, and that. Well, I'm working with a researcher named Niobe Wei at NYU who has spent like the last 25 years of her career sort of studying the importance of these kind of social connections for people's human development, especially among young people aged 10 to 25, which is not my area of expertise at all. But you know, she's really, really concerned about these questions of like, what begins, you know, like these social relationships are necessary in people's lives, and how can we, you know, we think about AI safety a ton. We don't really think about AI and social connections. And her big goal is to try to make this, as people continue to design these models, in the same way we look at, are they accurate? Are they safe? She wants us to also be like, are they also pro-social? And actually that study I was telling you about before, where people have used LLMs and browser extensions to like reorganize people's social media feeds on the fly, I'm involved in another big collaborative effort where we actually ran a tournament, and I was one of the judges, where people submitted what they thought would be more pro-social algorithms, and then we had a bunch of us who were judges who had to like judge them, and then the top 5 that seemed most promising were subject to rigorous scientific evaluation. And that paper is now coming out as well. So I think people are thinking about this. And I think we have probably I mean, I was talking about this with the podcast earlier. Like, I got into social media when social media was called liberation technology, right? Like, it was going to help bring democracy around the world. Now, 5 years later, my co-author Nate Persley was writing articles called Can Democracy Survive the Internet? But like, there was a component of social media about like, when it originally came onto the political scene, is that it was going to help people get organized in autocratic societies because it was a form of media that the state couldn't control. And now we're coming full circle to AI and all sorts of questions about state control. So it continues to be a very interesting field to be involved with, and lots of research questions. And I think those kinds of questions you're asking are these social questions are super, super important. And I think we're gonna unfortunately, you know, fortunately or unfortunately, we're gonna see some of the effects of people becoming even less social as these AI models get even more entertaining. It's like you've gone back from Fortnite, which is like partially how like my son got through the pandemic, was that like after his like 6 hours of online schooling, he could get together with his friends virtually and play Fortnite. I really credit that game with helping make the pandemic. I'm sure some of you also had that who are in the room. You're all the same age as my kids, right? Like, who had those same experiences, right? Like various forms of this thing. What would the pandemic be like if everybody went to AI afterwards, right? When they were at home and they couldn't leave their houses and stuff like that. So this isn't my research area, but I think these are really important questions to be asking.
This concludes our program.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming out, everybody. 30, but I'm happy to answer any. If you didn't get a chance to ask your question, I'm happy to stand up here and chat a little while longer.